gonna have some music.
Yeah, to really set the mood. Well, welcome again, everyone. I am Meredith Shiner. I'm a director at the University of Chicago Urban Network. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today, and I'll introduce our panel momentarily. But first, a little bit about the Urban Network. So we help promote the work in urban policy and practice for more than 24 units across the university. And this is a really important time for us to elevate voices of key scholars and practitioners across campus, not just because it's always important being in the city of Chicago, but also because at this critical moment of time, we're exploring how cities work, how they serve all of their residents, and there's potentially no topic area where that's more important than public education. So in this second of 3 conversations on the intersection of racism and public policy, it's a real privilege to be able to spend this hour with you all talking about the intersection of racism and public education. I think about the work of one of the other scholars on our campus, Eve Ewing, when she talked about structural racism. She said, people think racism is a jockey on a horse, but really racism is like a carousel where all of the horses are mechanically moving and people think that they're moving the horses, but really it's a system that exists that's really pulling all of the levers. And so when we think about public education, how we finance it, how we approach it, one of the cool things about what happens at the university in terms of thought leaders and practitioners is that we're approaching public education from every different angle. So with that, I want to introduce some of the people who are here part of the conversation representing the work of the university. And I'll start with Dr. Elaine Allensworth. She's the director of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. Next, we have Tanisha Legault-Washington. She's the interim leader on the University of Chicago Urban Teacher Education Program. We have Dr. Nicole Marwell, who's an associate professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. And we have Dr. Shante Robinson, who's an assistant professor at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice. This conversation will be moderated by Lauren Camera. She's a senior education reporter for US News and World Reports, and also one of my favorite people. Not that the people at the university aren't my favorite, they are, but Lauren is a former colleague of mine from when I was a reporter in Washington. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to her. But again, thank you to everyone who joined from the University of Chicago Network and people within the city of Chicago and around the world for this conversation today. And we're looking forward to bringing future conversations to you as soon as next May, but also throughout the year. Lauren.
Thanks so much, Meredith. I appreciate it. Nice to see you as well. Very excited to be here. I am hoping that everyone has lots of questions. So whenever you hear a question, please just put them into the Q&A. We'll sort of be looking at them throughout the time we have our discussion. And yeah, so I'm really excited to be here again. I've been covering education for over a decade, and this pandemic has really sped up a lot of the things that I've been reporting about the last decade. I mean, of course, the pandemic shined a spotlight on all of the inequalities built into the K-12 system that, you know, the panelists here have been wringing their hands about for decades, but weren't necessarily visible to everyone. Everything from, you know, homelessness, hunger, racial health disparities, access to broadband internet, et cetera, et cetera. And Shante, I'd love to start with you. If you wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of the history of public schools being looked to as solutions for some of these social problems and how the pandemic really sort of tore the door off of all these inequalities.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. I find it humorous when people often say, let's keep politics out of schools, let's keep social issues out of schools, let's protect young people from all the things that are happening in our society, when we have traditionally always given public schools the space and the responsibility to deal with and solve some of our most pressing societal issues and our problems. So if you think back to even the mid-1900s, when we had huge amounts of immigration to the country from various European nations, and how we started to deal with that is we started to have the schools do an assimilation process. You know, we have all these young children who couldn't speak English. And not only could they not speak English, but we needed schools to teach them how to be quote unquote American, assimilate them into the culture of what it means to be in a democratic state. And all of that was put on the backs of schools, K-12 schools. If you look at public health crises, COVID-19 isn't the first public health crisis we've had in this country, but we've looked to schools to help us solve some of those, at least in small part. As you think about it, I was talking to my mother as she talked about how she got her smallpox vaccine in school, that she was still in a segregated schooling space, and nurses came and vaccinated everyone there. Right. So my children may very well remember a COVID-19 vaccine in their school as well. That's yet to be seen. So we've always looked to schools to solve those problems. In the 1970s and 80s, we have all these young people driving and getting into car accidents. How do we solve it? Hey, schools, driver's ed. Now you have to hire someone or take one of your coaches. I remember it was my football coach, teach driver's ed, teach them how to drive. And that way they can go get their license and they can be better equipped for the road. So we've always put those responsibilities on schools and yet given them very little resources to get those problems solved. And yet with what they have, they've been able to do that in the past with most social ills.
And so when the pandemic came and shut down schools, all of these social safety nets went away.
They did,
and then we're slowly and then slowly schools had to figure out, okay, well, we'll repurpose bus drivers to drop off food, or we'll park our buses in communities and put hotspots on them so that kids without internet can tap in to the internet that way. I've talked and interviewed a lot of social workers who are right now going door to door and knocking, trying to find kids who have disengaged entirely. There are millions of these kids across the country. Can you guys speak to a little bit about how schools have sort of had to do double duty over this pandemic, even though they have so few resources to do all of this with?
Yes, definitely schools. When I was listening to Shantae talk about, I was thinking about the community schools model, and there are certain schools that kind of have this model, but I think all schools, even if they don't have that particular model, they provide services. So I was looking today, even thinking about the food services. And so the food services during the pandemic, schools were closed, and then parents and communities, these became hubs where anyone could come and get food, for their families. And when I was thinking about actually this morning when I was doing drop off, thinking about just the opportunity there, I think, to get more of those roots in the community. I was wondering about how many other, outside of just the parents of that school are now in the school connecting with the lunchroom staff, what connections are made to support as well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities because schools have had to be looked at in a certain way and kind of provide a certain space during the pandemic that's been different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic, forced all of a sudden, just a huge effort to think about how to provide students all the supports they need that they might ordinarily get at school, and then also what they would need to engage in learning under remote learning. And, it's an extraordinary effort. I think, immediately people were very worried about things like lunch and breakfast, and how do we make sure that students have the nutrition that they need so that they can, not just engage in learning, but so that they can have what they need, in terms of their own development and well-being. And then, of course, the technology demands in terms of being able to access remote learning, being able to access teachers. And Nicole can talk a lot more about that in terms of all those different technology demands. But also, being able to have the connections and contact, for teachers and school staff to be able to contact families. Some schools, I think we're much better organized in terms of having regular school communication, having contact, having updated phone numbers and all those kinds of things. than other schools that suddenly didn't have as many connections in the community. They weren't used to having regular communication home and really had to scramble and realize they weren't able to connect with a lot of students, and then not knowing why and whether families were going through crises or if it really was just a lack of having that information. So it really left, there's just a lot of variability based on families, based on resources that families have, resources that schools have, prior connections in the community. So, I think when we look at what's happened to students, it's so variable, all across, and very specific, family by family, as well as school community to school community. I think it's, the pandemic has really made very obvious a lot of the differences in resources that families have. I think all families all of a sudden realized they needed to get updated in terms of technology and bandwidth, and became very aware of what is the space that people have to actually do homework at school, and for students to get support in terms of doing their work at school. And there's a lot of variability there that I think everyone suddenly became very aware of and realized. But we also have to recognize that even before the pandemic, families have very different resources. And a lot of times it's invisible to families that have sufficient resources, just how much they're putting in terms of resources to make sure students can come to school every day ready to learn. I mean, like if you don't have access to reliable transportation, a lot of families have 2 cars, 1 car breaks down, you still have another car, or you have money for bus fare, or money for a taxi. A lot of families don't have that. So just getting to school every day, and a lot of families don't have access to good health care. One family member gets sick, everyone has to go to the emergency room. Everyone's tired the next day, or a family member gets sick, child has to stay home and take care of a family member. And so, there are always these resource issues that I think a lot of times are invisible. They just became magnified, and people became much more aware of resource issues under the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nicole, I was wondering, one of the very first things we saw at the onset of the pandemic when schools went virtual was this crisis of the digital divide, which I have to say I've been writing about for a decade. Like it's been there the whole time, but suddenly people realize, oh, there are tens of millions of students who either do not have a connection, don't have a good enough connection, or are lacking some type of, technical device to be able to connect to the internet. That was the first, I think, huge hurdle that schools had to face. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that just, how schools dealt with that? How policymakers are looking at this newly and fresh now, really sort of understanding the depth of the problem that maybe they didn't realize initially?
Yes. So as you said, and aligning with what Elaine said about the other kinds of resource disparities, we have known for a long time that there is a digital divide. We have known for a long time that there are certain groups and communities that are not connected to the internet. And there have been activists talking about this issue for a decade and more. What the pandemic did is, like with many other things, it really shone a spotlight on this, and it became so crucial because now we're talking about, this is children's social right to a public education. And if we as a society, if we as a government cannot fulfill that social right of children, we are really in a bad place. And so this did cause, as you say, a sort of mad scramble. People recognized immediately how critical it was to try to do something about this and to do something about it at scale. And here in Chicago, a lot of people think about the digital divide often as being a rural problem. And it's true that about 1/3 of Americans who are not connected to the internet are in rural areas. And the reason they can't get connected is because there actually just isn't internet infrastructure. But in urban areas like Chicago and other cities, it's a different problem. We have a lot of internet infrastructure. It varies in quality, but we have a lot of it. The problem is really about affordability. And so what we're looking at right now is how are we addressing the fact that 2/3 of Americans who are not connected to the internet are not connected because they can't afford to purchase the service. And when you look at that, and you have to look at, well, why is internet so expensive in the United States? And in fact, it's probably twice as expensive here as it is in a lot of the other Western democracies to connect to the internet. And what we really need to figure out is, how do we bring down that price? How do we make sure that people are connected? And here in Chicago, we have this terrific program. Chicago has really been a leader in the nation with this. The Chicago Connected program, which involves Chicago Public Schools solving problems, again, like Shantae was pointing out. They figured out who are the students who are not connected to the internet, and let's make sure that we connect them. And so they raised $50 million from private donors to make sure that students could be connected. We've connected a lot of kids and families in Chicago so far. There are still kids and families who are eligible but not connected. And there's a bigger set of challenges that are coming down the road at us in terms of where we're going in the future. And I'll just put one of them out there on the table because I'd be interested to hear from other panelists. You know, the Biden administration is moving a lot of efforts forward in terms of internet connectivity. The major approach right now appears to be subsidies. In other words, government will pay existing internet service providers to connect people, which on a short-term basis is great. But we really do want to be thinking, is that the way that we want to move in the longer term, providing taxpayer dollars to essentially monopolistic internet service providers and enriching them in the process? We really want to be thinking about, is that the way we want to go with this problem?
Anyone want to take that question?
Seems like
I think it's a great question. I would say just offhand, and having not researched much of it, that the amount that the United States uses in taxpayer money to subsidize corporate 500 companies, Fortune 500 companies, all these major industries that can be paying a lot more for their fair share in the country, I think we can, as taxpayers, say we need to invest a little bit more in our educational system. And part of that is ensuring that every K-12 student has access to broadband internet. That if we say every child should have access to clean water, every child should have access to a public education. And in 2021, public education is directly tied to having access to the internet. We can't say we're preparing global citizens or preparing citizens for a global economy in any scale if we have a third, 25%, even 10% of our child population not having access. So I think it's a small lift for this country to be able to do so. Right now, the federal government spends on average 2% of its entire federal budget on public education. I think we need to increase that. And I think this is one way to do that.
I'm curious what your thoughts are, any of you, about, now that so many students are connected to the internet that weren't before, whether that stays remains to be seen, but let's assume for a minute it does, and we have a lot more low income students whose them and their families are now connected to the internet. Is that going to be a vehicle for change? Like how should we be thinking about whether that in some way like really positively impacts their ability to sort of keep up with their wealthier peers?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say like having access to internet should be baseline for all children. So to think about like it puts them forward, I think it's part of the reason there is an achievement gap is the lack of access, is lack of resources. So I definitely agree that it will help. But to me, I'm like, it's baseline. Every child needs that. Every child needs that to succeed in school. Even before the pandemic, it was needed.
Yeah. it's like it's necessary but not sufficient. You know?
Exactly.
I think there's a lot of hope right now. Like a lot of people are thinking, okay, this gives children and also families greater access to the internet, which could potentially, provide access to jobs and resources. But it'll need to be sustained. And we know technology gets old like that. And it's not just enough to have access. If not, for example, if you're a teacher and you know that not all of your students have, strong internet connection where you can stream videos and things like that, you're not going to require it. You're not going to use it in your instruction.
Exactly.
Not everyone has access. So it really requires universal, strong access.
And I guess I would say that, we can't treat internet connection like the silver bullet. Like if every kid gets an internet connection, now all our education problems are solved. As Tanisha was saying, it's a baseline, just like kids need,
Books.
paper and pencils and books. People need internet. Internet is a tool that brings people access to the opportunities that are out there, but it's not the silver bullet. It's not going to paper over all the other longstanding challenges in public education and in the achievement gap.
And speaking of the achievement gap, a lot of coverage and conversation has focused on the widening achievement gap because of the pandemic. Low-income students, students of color, English learners, students with disabilities have been disproportionately impacted in terms of their ability to learn this year compared to their other peers. And I'm wondering if this is a question for everyone, but I know, Elaine, you've done a lot of work in this space. If you could maybe kick us off in just talking a little bit about what you're seeing, what your expectations are coming out of the pandemic, and what kinds of questions. This has been one thing that has been infuriating for me as a reporter who really wants good data to be able to bolster some of my stories. The lack of good data until very recently has, I think, it's been a huge hurdle to a lot of what we're trying to do to help kids.
Yeah, I know. So there's a lot of concern that's out there. And so, it is frustrating not knowing. I think the one thing we can say for sure, again, it's highly variable. There's a lot that's, you hear a lot in the news about learning loss. This is something people keep talking about, learning loss, learning disruption. I think there are a lot of assumptions in those conversations, a lot of, kind of deficit thinking. And also a lot of times it's made universal, like, oh, students, lost generation, students are going to be so far behind. And I think we have to be very careful. I think let's be eyes wide open that it's been a really difficult year and that, a lot of students have really struggled. But also, a lot of families, a lot of teachers, have worked really hard to actually make sure students are, have opportunities to learn at home. There are, I think also, these studies from the 1980s get brought up a lot about, there were these studies that said, there's greater summer learning loss among low-income families than families with more resources. And so, it's used to say, we're going to have greater inequality, learning loss is going to be greater in low-income families. And of course, there's definitely been differences in terms of the impact of the pandemic. But those studies actually have not been replicated in recent years. They were based on poorly designed tests, honestly. That there's actually the difference in, everyone forgets things over the summer. It's just how our brains work. And the differences are actually not different by students' family income. And families, all families are working really hard. And so I think we have to be careful not to make assumptions, first of all, that everyone is, that there are all these families that are not at all engaged in learning when many families are working really hard to support students and make sure students are engaged in learning. Another thing that happens, a lot of this conversation has been driven by reports that have come out from testing companies that have, looked, have kind of estimated what is, how far students are behind in math and English language arts based on assessments that are given, based on, past data, and then more recently in terms of some new data, and they sound very dire. They'll say, 1 to 2 months in English language arts, and 3 to 5 months in math, that students are behind where they would have been. It sounds really scary to people. Again, let's acknowledge there's some students who have really struggled, and we're going to need to give some students help. But that data, actually, if you put it in context, 1 to 2 months, even 4 to 5 months, actually puts most students at pretty much almost the same place they were. It doesn't put them behind a grade level. It doesn't, it still keeps most students at actually grade level learning. And, if we look at past research in terms of students who've had disruption in learning, that's recoverable within 3 years, as long as students are entering, a safe, supportive, challenging learning environment. Students encounter, difficulties all the time. They'll have a bad year, something disruptive will happen. If they're in a safe, supportive environment, challenging environment, subsequently, they can recover, right? And so what's going to be most important is, right now, I think a lot of people are trying to focus on what are those skills that they didn't learn, and we need to make sure we test them and we find exactly what they didn't learn. We need to, support students going forward, and then, be aware that, they may need more support than they normally would, right? And make sure that, they have that supportive learning environment. And, that's what's actually most important for them going forward.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you bring that up, because I've had talks with many of our teachers, and this idea of the widening achievement gap. Personally, as you were talking, I kept shaking my head, because personally, I think the focus on the gap and the widening gap and the kind of deficit thinking that comes from it, I don't think our students benefit from this focus, especially from their teachers. And so when you have a teacher that's looking at their classroom and thinking of the lack, what's missing, the gap, et cetera, what happens is, well, what we've seen happen, it affects their beliefs about the students that are in front of them, which affects how they teach the students, which affects how our students perform. And this is one of the ways that this gap happened to start, continues to happen, because, we categorize students based on certain measures, and then we can talk about what those measures are. And, I like what you said about even where these measures came from and what they're really measuring. And then we classify students and put them into hierarchies, and we perpetuate the hierarchy with students based on our beliefs at times. And so really being able to shift the thinking, even when they talk about the achievement gap, the way I kind of internalize it, I'm like, it's a teaching gap, because I'm like, when students get taught well, they learn well. And when students don't get taught well, and how students get taught well, there's so much to unpack around the teaching. But the belief around our students, and really being able to shift this thinking around the gap, and how do we fix the gap or fill the gap, to really being able to see the students in front of us, the strengths they bring, and how we build from those strengths. I think the other thing that would help is when we're talking about all these measures, and trying to get the 3 months, and really taking the time to what's important for our students to learn, so it's like, as a third grade teacher, when you come in and in thinking about, okay, these were third graders, they really didn't have second grade, it's an overwhelming thought when you come from it that way. But when you're able to kind of say okay, here are the main things, I want students to learn, let me see where they are with these things, and let me think about building. I think that mindset can help teachers to be more focused and not kind of spiral into the negativity that can happen because of it.
I'd like to add also this idea of achievement gaps and teaching gaps. When we talk about that, we're often talking micro, right? We're talking about individual teachers, individual schools, individual districts. But if we want to talk about the structural and systemic issues of what's happening with our most marginalized young people in the country, right? So the topic of today is racism, right? So let's say the big R word, racism. So if we're looking about that, then we have to stop talking about the achievement gap and the teaching gap, right? We have to do what Gloria Ladson-Billings tried to do many years ago, teach us to say, wait a minute, there's an education debt. Mm-hmm. So if we reframe the answer, if we say there's not an achievement gap, there's an education debt that's happening in this country. Mm-hmm. And if we look at it and position it the same as we do our national debt, that the United States as a society has a debt that is owed, particularly to Black and brown folks. And if we position it that way, and we look at all the accumulation of the years that Black folk weren't able to go to school, that Black folks were penalized for learning. And then we take that into Jim Crow, where they were segregated into schools and were forced to deal with incredibly low resources. And we can take that to the present, where we see schools that are predominantly Black and brown are still under-resourced, are still more likely to have teachers who are not fully qualified, right? Who are not as experienced. Right. And so in that space, if we have an education debt, we can keep talking about gaps, and that's not going to get us where we need to be. If we talk about the debt and how we pay that down, then we start talking about structural and systemic issues. We start talking about policy writ large that needs to change so that students can change across the country, not just in Chicago, right?
And Shantae, I'd add, I was the one who said achievement gap, so that's on me, but there's an internet debt as well, if you want to talk about it that way, which I think is a very useful framing. The reason that our internet is so expensive is because, unlike in many other countries, we decided back in the 1990s to allow private companies to own internet infrastructure. Right? We did not build it as publicly owned infrastructure. And so in the functioning of a market, they're going to lay the infrastructure where the customers are. And so what you have then is a debt in terms of the distribution of infrastructure, which leads to what looks like inferior performance of the internet infrastructure that does exist in the neighborhoods where you're seeing, particularly on the south and west sides of Chicago, for example, but in other Black communities and communities of color. And so, the big challenge there is that, speaking of data, we have really bad data on where the internet infrastructure actually is. And this is because, we've been building different kinds of infrastructure on top of older kinds of infrastructure, and not even the companies that own the infrastructure really know where it is. What we do know is how people's internet seems to perform. And so, one of the things that we're trying to work on is to build a better understanding, build better data about what that internet performance looks like across different neighborhoods in Chicago for a particular research project, and to be able then to perhaps quantify this notion of an internet infrastructure debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to go back to bring it back to the debt issue. We know right now that approximately 70% of schools are offering some type of in-person learning, but by and large, the majority of schools that are still virtual and enroll mostly Black and brown students, a lot of low-income students. They have more students who are in the process of still learning English, students with disabilities. What type of supports, assuming that these schools can and do reopen for in-person next year, what type of supports will they need?
So sorry. Go ahead, Elaine.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead, Shantae.
I would like to see school districts across the country, but particularly districts that reside in very hard hit areas for COVID-19, right? COVID-19 didn't impact the country in an equal way per se, particularly for those who we lost community members, we lost family members. Black and brown communities were particularly hit hard with COVID-19 in those losses. So schools have to invest in social emotional learning. Schools have to invest in some mental health folks, some social workers, some therapists. Schools have to understand that, in order to connect the academics, sometimes you have to also connect to the humanity in people, right? And you have to acknowledge that, I sort of frame it as a reckoning, that we haven't reckoned with the over 500,000 people who we've lost to this disease, right? We haven't reckoned with how our government sort of failed us in those spaces. We haven't reckoned with how it disproportionately impacted Black and brown folks. And so schools are going to be forced to reckon, like individually, with their students who are coming back and dealing with all this emotionality and this social emotional baggage of coming out of a pandemic. And if schools aren't equipped to deal with that, what we're going to see is discipline spike. We're going to see schools react in the same way that they normally react, which is to exclude, expel, suspend. And those are going to be disproportionately Black and brown children, children who are impoverished, and children who have IEPs, right? So I think we have to start doing that now so that we can prepare, so we're not dealing with this in a reactionary way 3 years from now when we say, wow, we've seen a really big spike in expulsions for these students. Why is that? So we can do that work now.
Yeah, and just building on that, if you think about this as a debt, which is a great way to think about it, and you can think about, how do you pay that debt? Well, we make sure that's, not only you make sure that schools have social workers, they have support, social emotional supports for students and for teachers, because teachers also, need support, and also then they have academic supports for students. Like, so it's already in place. So if we know students are going to need more support, we know, if you want to, we want students to engage in learning. We don't want sometimes there's this idea, which is completely false, that social emotional supports and academic supports are different. Like that, you give academics to focus on social emotional. You don't do that, because if you focus only on one or the other, you're not helping students. You focus only on the social emotional, they fall behind academically, then they've got another problem. You focus only on the academics when students really need social emotional support. They can't focus on the academics, right? And so that means teachers need supports, schools need supports. We should have those in place. One of the academic supports that's been shown to be most effective is high intensity tutoring, where you have tutors that are available to help students so they can be successful in their classes. So if they start to fall behind, immediately there's someone who can give them the support so that they don't actually get behind, right? They immediately are caught up, right? And because once students fall behind, it's just very hard to catch up. So, and one thing I hear is, how are we ever going to afford, to tutors for all these students? But it's not all the students, right? It's like, if we think about the debt and who is owed the debt, what are the schools that where we actually need to have resources, and then we pay attention to who, we said there's a lot of variability across families, who really needs it, so that we have those resources in place right away when students need them, right away when teachers need them, right? Then everyone has a chance to be successful. Otherwise, it's just like, if we treat everything, the same and normal, and say everyone's on an equal plane with the same resources, then all of those other differences come into play, right? And then we say, well, why are there differences in outcomes? Well, because we didn't pay that debt. Right.
Yeah, and Tanisha, I'd love to get we have so many good questions coming in. Thank you to everyone who's putting in questions. We're going to get to those in 1 minute, but I wanted to sort of get Tanisha's thoughts. My goodness, we are asking so much of teachers right now. I wanted to sort of hear from you, sort of like what you're thinking, what you're seeing when it comes to teacher burnout. How can we better support teachers coming out of this pandemic? And then separately, I realize this is a completely separate question, but what can we do to sort of increase the number of Black and Latinx teachers? And I know Biden administration has recently proposed some funding for this, but I'm curious to hear what you've seen that has worked. recently?
Okay, so those two questions. So I guess the first one around teacher burnout. We all know, and I think now that the pandemic has highlighted and all parents have had to teach, I think it's really highlighted like the work of the teacher, how much it really is, how stressful it is. And then you can see why burnout, is so prevalent in the field. So when we think about what we can do to support teachers, the first thing is providing an environment where our teachers can be listened to, can be respected, can be respected as professionals, can be part of. So even when we're talking about all the challenges of a school, all the challenges that happen in a school, and we just talked about things that policymakers need to do, and all these things of the people ahead. But who's really dealing with it day to day is that teacher, because there's 30 of them in the classroom, and they're the ones that kind of have to manage it. And so our teachers need to be in a space, because they have to deal with the problem, the problems or the challenges. They need to be in a space where they are listened to and part of the problem solving practice. When you have teachers that are invested in students and they have a say into like, hey, we have these students, how are we going to get together? And they're in an environment where they're listened to, where they're supported, where they are collaborative, and it's not just a teacher in their silo figuring it out, but it's a team of us, and we can put our heads together and we can think about the guiding principles, in terms of what we want from our students, and we can problem solve and kind of persevere together. I think when we frame things that way and really respect teachers as professionals, there is less of the burnout. I think the burnout comes because when the challenges are there and all we can see is challenge after challenge and lack and missing, and and it's just me and I can't, and as teachers give up. So the other piece is like, how do we as educational leaders or schools, like what are we doing to really help to inspire our teachers and help keep them motivated and help keep in front of them the reason they became teachers in the first place? Because that mindset also has to be cultivated as well. And then I think the third thing, especially in light of what's going on with the pandemic, is the mental health of teachers, and kind of that the mental health of teachers, but just the space for them to kind of decompress. You can't, I never can say the thing right about the empty cup. You can't pour from the empty cup. And so thinking about like, what are the ways that what are the ways that we're pouring into our teachers professionally, et cetera, taking care of them as well. And I think setting up an environment where that happens more will keep more of our teachers. The other question, I'll just remember. Okay, so the other question around teachers of color. And so this has become, I guess, recently something that's been talked about a lot, even though historically, we've seen the amount of teachers of color decrease over the years. And when you think of public education and the students that are in front of it and the percentage of Black and brown students, and when you see the teaching force is very much, it's very much not representative of the students. So I think the first step in retaining or recruiting teachers is for districts to really understand the value that teachers of color bring to the classroom. There's been lots of research around teachers of colors that have been successful with students, particularly in urban settings. But I think also the understanding that a teacher of color that's successful is going to help all students, not just students of color. And I think when we talk about racism in education, and how to combat some of the things in racism, I also think that's also a solution there, because when you're in these areas, when you are in schools that are primarily white and they've never seen a Black teacher, I remember my first school, I was one of the very, they had never seen a Black teacher. And I think just that experience, as a fourth grader, and having a Black teacher, and kind of having that power dynamic, or seeing that person in power, it definitely affects their education as well. So I think valuing it. And then the other thing is being intentional about recruiting and retaining those teachers. For UTEP, we had historically, because we're a teacher program through University of Chicago, which the University of Chicago has not been historically very diverse. So the very first years of UTEP, the teachers that we were that were coming to us were not diverse as well. And so when we made an intentional effort to recruit future teachers of color by going to HBCUs and talking, going to HBCUs and talking to those future teachers, partnering with organizations of color, and letting them know, we were able to see a big increase of teacher candidates of color to our program as well. So I guess the short answer is seeing the value and really being intentional about the recruitment. And then the piece about training is the support that teachers need, which I would say all teachers need support. Once you get in the field, you learn how to teach, and then you get in the field, and it's like the rubber meets the road. And so having the support there through coaching, through mentorship. And I think if we want to speak specifically to teachers of color, having mentorship that is kind of specific that way as well, I think would help to retain those teachers as well.
Yeah, I want to get to some of these questions because they're so good.
Lauren, can I jump in for just a minute?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
I wanted to say that, I teach graduate students, and every year I have at least one, if not several, come up to me and say, I'm their first Black teacher, professor they've ever had. Yeah. They've gone through K-16 without a Black teacher. Mm-hmm. And they're meeting me, and then they say I'm the best teacher they've ever had, but that's neither here or there. But
of course you are.
That's neither here or there. I don't want to get into that. But when Biden says we have a white supremacy problem in this country, mm-hmm. we're not going to solve it unless we first solve the problem of not wanting Black men and women in front of our children as people in power. Mm-hmm. Right? Until we reckon with that. Because that was a structural policy change in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when desegregation. We fired all the Black teachers who were doing great. We let them go, and we hired more white teachers. Until we reckon with that and reverse that, white supremacy will still be a domestic terrorist problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is so important. I live in Washington D.C., and I'll just say as an aside, my son, we have free pre-K 3 and 4 here. So we're really excited about that. My son, who's 5, has only had Black teachers. And that has been, really important. And in exactly what you're saying, Shantae, I think it's so true. Okay, so I want to get to some of these questions. We'll start with this one first. Teachers in urban areas have been isolated from the communities they serve, particularly in poorer neighborhoods. Has the pandemic given them a unique opportunity at all to sort of get to know their communities and to win support from their constituents?
That's an interesting question.
I think so too.
I can't say if, I think it would depend on, the teachers. Unfortunately, you have situations where teachers don't necessarily live in the same communities that they teach in. I would definitely say for our program, so it made me think about our teacher preparation program, which our foundations year, we start with our students really partnering with community organizations across Chicago, because understanding the communities and really being able to see the community from an asset-based perspective versus deficit perspective. I think that perspective is crucial for teachers that are going to teach in the urban setting. So I think it's a great question. I think the pandemic could give an opportunity, a unique opportunity to get to know communities if if teachers have kind of taken advantage of that.
Yeah, this next question, Shantae, you might be able to speak to this. The pandemic certainly increased attention on the reality versus expectations of the societal role of public school. How would you say that expectations changed the reality of this role? Did they narrow, expand, or just change?
It is a great question. I think we forget just how much schools do. Because it's easy to drop our kids off, and that becomes this sort of amorphous four-wall space where we've all been for many years, but we often forget how much we rely on those spaces to do so much for our families and for our communities. So I think it highlighted that. I think last year this time, everyone was willing to give every teacher $100,000 if they just take their children away from them for just please. Like, I've had a couple months with them. I have neglected you in the past. I have railed against you in the past. Teachers are the heroes in our society. And now we're sort of going back to teachers get summers off. Why are they complaining about having to teach in a pandemic, right? We have these short-term memories about what it was like to be, having to teach fractions to our own children. And the frustration.
To one child, right? To one child.
To one child. To one child. To which I have to walk away because I'm just not prepared. And I'm an education person, right? Here I am, an education person, and I'm telling my child, please walk away because this fraction is bothering me, and I'm not understanding why. So we have short-term memories about the people who really allow us to be our best selves. And a group of those people are teachers. Teachers are sort of the unsung heroes. And so, if anything, we're going to give schools and teachers even more things to do, and probably not many more resources to get it done with, right? So now we got a few more social ills that we're going to have to deal with. And those are going to be put on the backs of schools as well. And I'm afraid that unlike the past, where we've given some schools the resources and the attention they need to deal with social ills, I don't think we have the will as a society to put the infrastructure and the money in those spaces in the ways that it needs to be. It doesn't need to be a short-term gap. This needs to be an intentional investment that goes generations. And until that happens, until we see as a society that we have to commit to that and commit in really big ways, that I think schools are still going to continue to flounder, and that teachers are still going to get burnt out. And that if anyone, who loses is all of us when all of our students aren't able to be their best selves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see the role of schools widening and resources still dwindling. And that's not a really good equation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a really big question. I think we can do it though. All right, this person asks, I've seen research and reporting showing that desegregation is an effective way to reduce the achievement gap, yet we seem so far from that as a country. What are your thoughts on the impact of desegregation? Are there any movements or communities that are making progress in this area? And I would also like to personally add on a question about how the pandemic may or may not be fueling more segregated school systems, especially in some of the larger urban areas where it's been difficult, more challenging for schools to reopen. And you're seeing people with more means, typically white, middle, upper class families, sort of leave the cities for, suburbs that they know will be open in person, or even enrolling their kids in private schools. I know it's a really big question.
Yeah, I think generally that I think the evidence does suggest that integrated schools are better for everyone. But we have this history that has, we have residential segregation, and then we have a lot, all of these policies that have, encouraged segregation in all kinds of ways. I don't know that there definitely has been a movement in terms of parents putting children into private schools and moving to the suburbs during the pandemic. I don't know that it's that large in terms of the total number of people, or that people won't re-enroll their students in public schools afterwards. I'd say it's possible, but changing these trends in terms of, we have all of these housing policies that have enforced, an incredible amount of segregation, certainly in Chicago, but all over the country. And we really need we need some intentional policies around housing and around schools if we're going to reverse these patterns, which are incredibly stark.
So
Yeah,
I
go
feel
ahead.
like we might need like 3 additional hours to actually tackle that one question.
Yes.
An hour of time is so much to ask for all of the participants who came to this conversation today, but not nearly sufficient to tackle all of the issues. So one, I wanted to thank the panelists and Lauren as a moderator for helping to have a really in-depth conversation, again, when there's so many angles to this story and to the challenges we're facing in public education. Thank you to the people who attended. I'm actually going to drop into the chat to everyone the invitation for our next event in May. We'll be talking about public safety. We'll be joined by Julian Castro, the former Democratic presidential candidate and Housing and Urban Development Secretary, as well as leaders from the university like Franklin Cozy-Gay and Sharon Fairley. So that's going to be a great conversation if it's anything like the conversation that we just had. So thank you to Dr. Allensworth, Dr. Robinson, Dr. Marwell, Tanisha. You all contributed such smart and empathetic and important thinking to this overall conversation. And it was an honor to be able to host you today in front of more than 200 people to get them to hear your thoughts. And this isn't the last part of the conversation that we'll have, but I think it's a really important beginning as we're sort of in this transitional phase, thinking about what it might mean to reemerge into the world. If you're more interested in what the Urban Network is doing, you can check us out at urban.uchicago.edu. And again, thanks to everyone for contributing your thoughts and your time, and for the people who presented today, especially your work every day on behalf of students here in Chicago and nationwide. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.